The final war between the X-Men and humanity is beginning, and the ending of this is crazy. It's gonna be absolutely nuts. So, what we do here is we initially open up with the Juggernaut. And I know it sounds weird to kind of point that out. The Juggernaut here is basically protecting the brain of the island of Krakoa. For those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, the long and short is that the island of Krakoa was supposed to be the X-Men's nation until Orchis attacked. And we'll talk more about Orchis here in a minute. But that was the start of the fall of X, right? Like just the attack on the mutant population. And it's what we're told here, right? It's said that nothing can stop the Juggernaut, but that's not true. Especially when a harpoon made from the discarded adamantium skeleton of Wolverine maims you. The mutants had been losing since the Hellfire Gala. That was when the initial attack by Orchis took place. Many were dead, the rest were scattered. An insurrectionist team of X-Men were leading the rebellion against Orchis. The battle to liberate Earth was officially underway, and it could be going better. Because again, up until this point, the X-Men were losing. The mutant population was losing. They've just been fleeing for their lives. Now, there is an army of mutants, 250,000 strong, waiting in the wings, just waiting to be recalled. They're in the White Hot Room. And for those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, you'll find that in the link to the X-Men playlist that covers everything from the fall of the House of X up until now. So you're not too far behind on everything. But you end up having this kind of like shield helicarrier that shows up that's being controlled by Orchis soldiers, and these goofballs come flying down and start attacking the Juggernaut, right? And of course, it's never gonna happen. It's like Marvel's attempts to make the Inhumans cool. It's never gonna happen, right? Like no one's ever gonna care. And that's literally what happens here. These guys just open fire on the Juggernaut. Nothing they do is going to hurt this guy. Is the Juggernaut as powerful now as he used to be? No. But he's still ridiculously overpowered. And so what they end up doing is they target the island instead. Now the reason why this is so important here is because the island is, by all standards of measurement, a seed. In any island, you could take any landmass out there and you can put Krakoa inside of it and it'll transform the terrain into a new habitat for the mutant population. If he goes, the X-Men just end up having to go back to Westchester, New York in the United States and living out their days, fleeing for their lives, hoping humanity doesn't kill them, right? Just back to the old stories that have been done to death in Marvel Comics. So that's why the Juggernaut's protecting Krakoa in the first place. And so in response to these soldiers targeting the brain of Krakoa, if we can call it that, the Juggernaut does two things. The first thing he does is he helps these guys understand their place in the bigger picture, and then he helps them finish with all their living. And so what we end up doing here is we switch over to Cyclops, the character that, for whatever reason that I can't fully explain, you guys are obsessed with. He is cool, but the dude just shoots concussive blasts, man. I never understood why people loved Cyclops so much. But you pick up with Cyclops and Dr. Alia Gregor. Now, here's the thing about these two guys, right? As it stands right now in Marvel Comics, the X-Men are fighting a war on two fronts. What we're reading here in the fall of the House of X, that's the war against Orchis. The other war that's being fought is with Professor Xavier and Rasputin, who's basically a mutant that has a whole bunch of powers, basically a bunch of X-Men powers, and they're fighting a war for the future. They're technically going against a being called Dominion, and that whole thing is covered in the Rise of Powers of X, which again, we are covering here on the channel. But when it comes to this confrontation here, the war for Earth and the future of the mutant population's survival, Dr. Alia Gregor and Cyclops came to the realization Orchis is not their main enemy. Somebody else is pulling the strings. There's a much bigger threat out there than Orchis. That's why I say the ending of this is crazy. Literally, their alliance here with Dr. Alia Gregor being one of the founders of Orchis, it's based on the idea, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, the cool thing here is that while Cyclops and Dr. Alia Gregor are making their way towards a particular destination, they're kind of met by like some foot soldiers, and Cyclops takes off the visor that's blocking his optic beams. Not even the ruby quartz glasses, not even the ruby quartz visor, it's just blocking his eyes. Takes the thing off, unloads on these guys with his concussive blast. Also, for those of you guys who are new to Marvel Comics, who don't know anything about Marvel, Cyclops' optic blasts are not heat vision. It's a concussive force. I know for a lot of people, they already know that, but for folks who don't know anything about Marvel, that's true. It's not heat, it's just like being punched in the face with lasers, is really all it is. Which is probably the greatest description of Cyclops' powers that's ever existed in Marvel Comics. That needs to become official, right? Getting punched in the face with lasers. But what ends up happening is that the two of them are making their way. The sister of Colossus, Illyana Rasputin, appears here. Now, have no illusions about Illyana, because you don't really get to see her do a lot in the X-Men comics in more recent years. She is grossly overpowered. Is she as powerful as Doctor Strange? No. But in terms of her ability to manipulate magic, this girl is OP. She can just do a variety of different things. But all Marvel's really done with her in more recent years is have her operate as a kind of teleporter, getting people in and out of impossible situations. But where she steps in and she tells Cyclops, I can get you out of here and get you where you need to be, throwing him a ruby quartz visor so you can use his powers as normal, his response is, no, right? And this is where you realize what's happening here. He says, I've been listening to the inner workings of Orchis for a long time. The human parts of the Force came gloating. They threatened and tortured me. Of course, all that happening while he was being held captive within the Orchis facility. But he says, the AI was all too quiet. I expect it didn't want us thinking about it. Dr. Gregor shares my concern. I know we're in a tough spot, but can the others save Krakoa without me? The response of Illyana, if it needs doing, then it will be done. Now, what we end up doing here is we transition away from Cyclops for a second, right? We move away from him for a second. We'll come back to him, but we end up transitioning over to the planet of Arakko, basically Mars. And that while most of the mutants on Arakko that had hailed from a different dimension, while like 99% of them, or some crazy number, were eradicated in Judgment Day, at the moment, Arakko serves as a kind of hub between a combination of mutants that were able to escape Earth and take up a safe haven here, as well as those mutants that survived the Great Purge of Thanos' uncle during the events of Judgment Day. Yes, Thanos has an uncle. His name's Uranos. He eradicated like 99% of the most powerful mutants in existence in 1 hour. That was Judgment Day. It was dope. We have a link to it at the end of this video. So here's the thing, right? Apocalypse, who's just this kind of demigod guy, but is one of the oldest mutants in existence. This guy is kind of leading the charge, but in fact, leading it will actually transition to Rogue here in a minute, which is one of the coolest moments. But he says, and now that Earth's mutants have raised their banners, a united and reforged Arakko will join our cousins. Who will join me? And this guy steps up and says, I am Woofer of Chicago. Now let's get to that W. I was made an X-Man by Shadowcat, i.e. Kitty Pryde. I stand ready to wage war to free my people. Now Apocalypse responds in saying, I hear the words of a true mutant. And that's one of the things to know about Apocalypse. Understand, this guy's broken. Like, I mean, just looking at him, he looks cool and everything. This dude's ridiculously overpowered. I mean, so much so that it kind of would have been an amazing fight in Judgment Day if we got to see him fight the uncle of Thanos, if we got to see him fight Uranos. Because I'm gonna tell you guys right now, I'm gonna call it, and I don't care what anyone says in the comments or otherwise, that fight would have been dope, and Apocalypse absolutely would have given him a run for his money. It would have been probably one of the greatest fights ever that we never got to see in Marvel because Marvel's stupid and chose not to give it to us. So the thing here is that Apocalypse is very much ceremonial. It's why the way in which they're talking are like battle formations, raising banners. We are officially going to war, right? And so with the questions asked by Woofer, like, how do we even get to Earth from here? And is Storm coming? The response of Apocalypse is there is still mutant magic left in these worlds, Woofer. As for the Storm, well, like all storms, she's difficult to predict. Now, the reason why this matters is twofold. Number one, Storm has received a massive power boost in Marvel Comics in recent years. So much so that she's become one of the most incredible fan favorites of the X-Men for people who have been reading for a while. For those of you guys who haven't been following X-Men at all, Storm's ridiculously popular, more popular now than she's ever been. A lot of that's because when she was here on Arakko, during and after the great purging of the mutant population that was here, she kind of became the leader. And this chick was a hoss. Like she was, dude, it was one, son. Dude, this chick waging war. I have a whole new respect for a pissed off Storm, more now than I ever did before. But the other thing is Storm's not here because she's busy resurrecting Magneto from the dead. That's the Resurrection of Magneto storyline. Currently, the two of them are going to be fighting the Shadow King, which is going to be pretty dope. But what you end up having is Manifold, who appears here. Now, Manifold is basically just a teleporter for the X-Men. He can teleport any distance across the universe, but he's their way to get from point A to point B. And in fact, he teleported an entire sword station, a space station, to Mars so they could all board, arms, armament, the whole 9 yards, and make their way to Earth. And that's when Rogue appears here. And she says, I know some of y'all are from Earth and have been waiting for this day, but nothing's easy. If you want to go home, we're gonna have to fight for it, right? So she's kind of just marshaling people together. And it's awesome they have Rogue on their side, because one of the things that Marvel could easily bring back here is Rogue from the Hecatomb, or in the years leading up to it. For those of you guys who don't know, there was a point in Marvel Comics when Rogue didn't just absorb the memories and powers of any mutant she touched, she held on to them. So there was a point where Rogue just had a variety of powers available to her. As far as I'm aware right now, and I could be wrong, if I am, correct me in the comments, but I don't know anything that's changed this. As far as I'm aware, right now, Rogue is kind of back to the level where she can only hold one power at a time. Sync is the guy who can duplicate multiple powers all at once. The Peter Petrelli of the X-Men, for those of you guys who watched Heroes. But once this sword space station arrives at the primary sword space station, all these mutants basically start launching their attack. And that's what's dope here, because you now have the mutant population officially going to war with humanity. Now, during this, what you end up doing is you switch over to Emma Frost and Kitty Pryde, who are piloting basically the Thunderbird. And they're met by a holographic projection of Tony Stark. Because do not forget, Iron Man is fighting on behalf of the X-Men here. The reason why he's not here at the moment is because he's working on his Mysterium armor, right? Like this whole new suit of armor with a whole new set of powers that we've never seen before. And I promise you, yes, everybody in Marvel Comics is excited to see what happens with this thing, because it's gonna be fire. But the kicker here is that there is one of the other employees, or the guys who formed Orchis, Dr. Stasis. He's one of the clones of Mr. Sinister. If you don't know what that means, within the context of this story, it's not overly important. That's more important with regards to the rise of powers of X. So you can largely ignore the idea that he's a version of Sinister throughout the rest of this video. But the bigger point is that he's just a bad guy. And he's basically the guy who initiated the attack on the mutant nation of Krakoa during the beginning of Fall of X that led to the downfall of the X-Men up to this point. In fact, it's under Stasis' leadership that they've been able to keep the X-Men on the ropes this entire time, that the mutant population has just been fleeing for their lives. But what had happened is that during the initial opening salvo, right, the opening event here, before Jean Grey died, she put a telepathic thought in the mind of Dr. Stasis, tricking him into believing that one of the X-Men, Firestar, had actually been an ally of theirs the whole time and had orchestrated their attack and had fed them the information they needed to orchestrate the attack on Krakoa. The reason why that was done is because it allowed Firestar to be positioned as a spy within Orchis, closest to its highest ranking member, or at least one of its highest ranking members. And she could feed information out there to anybody who was able to receive that information, namely Tony Stark. But the idea is that Stark basically relays a message to Emma and to Kitty Pryde from Firestar saying, if you're seeing this, I'm likely dead, because Dr. Stasis has figured out that I was a plant, right? That like my entire role here is a ruse and a telepathic suggestion. So I placed a tracker on him, go find this guy, kill Dr. Stasis. And so what happens is Tony Stark is told by Emma Frost, find Firestar, right? If you can't find her, then avenge her, right? What we end up finding out is that she's actually kind of kept in stasis, right, to a degree. And in fact, this comes by way of Kitty Pryde launching her attack on Dr. Stasis directly when she finds this guy trying to escape, quite literally from a private jet in a bunker. The least exciting thing, right? But still, the guy's like literally out in the middle of nowhere. I don't even know how he managed to fuel this thing up with no gas stations anywhere around. But he tries to basically take off. She shows up here, she launches an attack, and then she phases through and knocks his helmet off. Here's the funny thing here, right? He basically tells her, I know exactly where Firestar is, and I have a safeguard in place that if I die, this exact scenario here, she will die as well. I have the finest psi blocker implanted in my head, meaning no telepath can pierce my brain. And she's like, oh, you don't mean this, right? Do you the psi blocker that I just phased from your head when I knocked your helmet off? Is that the one that you're talking about? And she's like, Emma, do your thing. Emma Frost chimes in and immediately takes over the mind of Dr. Stasis, gets everything she needs. They figure out the location of Firestar, and basically Synch shows up and then rescues her. Here's the thing, man. Something to understand about Emma Frost. There's two sides to Emma Frost. There's the nice side, the corporate side, the one that says what she's supposed to say in any particular situation, walks the walk, and plays the part, right? Then there's the other Emma Frost, the one you meet when you piss her off. As one of the most powerful telepaths in existence, the last thing you want to do is piss this chick off. And she says that, right? Like, where you have Dr. Stasis who's begging for his life because he knows what can happen here when he's left to the mercy of Emma Frost. She says, I tried to be so good for so long, but you men broke me. You wouldn't let me be nice. I've destroyed men worth 10 of you, 100 of you. You hurt us. You hurt me. I could kill you where you grovel, but I won't. And of course, Dr. Stasis is like, yes, thank you. Okay, cool. I get to live. And she's like, but you're going to wish that I did. Instead, I will reach into your disgusting mind and pull forth your worst nightmares, your worst, most unhinged fears about mutants born from your voluminous, bigoted mind. And I promise you, it will feel very real. And so what she does is she forces this guy to experience every conceivable death that he could ever imagine happening to him at the hands of the X-Men. She uses his own subconscious against him. And we're told it only took a minute for Dr. Stasis' heart to begin shutting down. Of course, time is relative, and Emma Frost was a skilled telepath. She made that final 60 seconds feel like 10 years. It was just absolutely gruesome torture. Imagine only 1 minute's passed in the real world, but for 10 years, you experienced the most horrific ways to die, right? It would just be horrible. Like, it would just be this instance of your mind literally shutting down. And so in the end, he just ends up having a heart attack, and Dr. Stasis more or less just collapses. At that point, like, even though he's dead, they're like, so what do we do with the body, right? He's just a high-profile member of Orchis. How do we handle this? Enter Firestar. This girl's got a grudge, like she's got a bone to pick, right? She shows up, she's like, I got it, and using her powers over heat, burns this guy's entire body, right? Just incinerates him, and that's it. And they're like, cool, all right, awesome. We got the body sorted out, we killed the guy, good enough, right? At that point, you switch back over to Cyclops. Now, this is where things go nuts, because again, you have Magic who says, like, I can get you to where you need to go, right? Like, I can get you out of here, we can get you teleport, all that kind of stuff. He's like, no, right? Myself and Dr. Alia Gregor need to focus on what's actually happening here. And so Alia Gregor asks him, she says, have you heard the name Sentinel City? And she says, after our victory over Krakoa, your habitat on the moon was repurposed into a relay station with our Venusian mining settlement, except almost none of the ore made it back to Earth. It was used on site. And where Cyclops asks the question, used for what? The response of Alia Gregor is, I don't know. Nobody at Orchis seemed to know. Not even Director Devo, the guy running the entire operation. She says, I suspect that Omega Sentinel knew, maybe even Moira McTaggart. And so did you, Nimrod. And that's when they realize the main enemy here, or at least we realize the main bad guy here, is AI. Like Nimrod says, it's hard to surprise me, Dr. Gregor, but you've managed that feat 3 times. I didn't think I'd see you again. And so where she says, why the secrets, right? Why to keep all this stuff from me and everybody else? We're all working together, because one of the things to know is that Dr. Alia Gregor's husband was initially killed at the very beginning of House and Powers of X when the X-Men launched their attack against Orchis. Ever since then, her grudge against the X-Men was much stronger than it had ever been. But the brain patterns of her husband were essentially put in Nimrod, right? This new Sentinel. But what's been happening over time is Nimrod's own programming has started to override her husband's. And so where initially it started out as artificial intelligence assisting Orchis, now artificial intelligence has been controlling Orchis and operating its own scheme behind the scenes. And that's why you have Cyclops who tells Alia Gregor, that thing is not your husband. And she says, yes, that's true, but Nimrod only exists because of my husband's sacrifice. I know he can calculate the truth of it. And Nimrod simply says, Dr. Gregor, I choose not to lie to you, and kills her on the spot. And he says, so I'm giving you this gift earlier than I calculated. He literally twists her head around on her shoulders. Cyclops immediately loses it, fires off his optic beams at Nimrod, knowing nothing's going to happen because Nimrod's the perfect sentinel, right? This guy's ability is to not only withstand some of the most powerful mutants in existence just based on existing knowledge of their powers, whenever he comes across any mutant that is not in the database of Orchis, that he can also calculate what their powers are and then calculate a weakness and then adapt himself to give himself that power to use that weakness against him, right? I mean, the guy was literally designed to adapt to any situation against virtually any mutant that he faces outside of like ultra high reality warpers. But he says, as artificial intelligence, we calculated that we'd have the greatest chances of success if mutants and humans were at each other's throats. You would not look up to notice the sword hanging over your head. Sentinel City is not an outpost or a mine. It is a tool to sterilize this hellish planet once and for all. So now it's not the X-Men facing off against Orchis. Orchis is just a collection of humans who wanted to kill mutants. Now they have to face off against the most feared thing when it comes to the X-Men, a completely self-aware artificial intelligence program designed for nothing more than to sterilize humans and mutants. My friends, we are looking at Days of Future Past. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you guys need to get caught up, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.